I have told this story before, not to anyone who asked for it, no one ever asked, but to myself in the dark in the years after Mortem, to make sure I had the sequence right, to make sure I hadn't invented any of it. I hadn't, I wish I had. My name is Fritz Ludwig. I was a doctor. I used the word was deliberately. You should know what I was before you know what happened to me, because what I was made the whole thing worse. I was not a soldier. I was not a man who had learned to love danger or who had conditioned himself to receive shock without flinching. I was a physician. I had spent 11 years of my life learning how bodies worked and another 6 learning how to put them back together when they broke. I understood anatomy. I understood physiology. I understood, better than most men alive in 1968, exactly what the human organism required in order to continue functioning. I tell you this because when you understand how a thing works, when you can name every component and describe every process in clinical Latin, when the whole elegant machine is as familiar to you as a sentence you have read 1,000 times, that is when it becomes most terrible to watch it fail. I had watched bodies fail before, on operating tables, in field triage, in the gray administrative aftermath of industrial accidents that the company called testing incidents and filed into folders I was not supposed to see. I had learned not to flinch. I had learned the distance a physician requires. Mortem, New Mexico took that distance from me. It started with Jeremy. He came to my office at 7 minutes to 8 on the evening of October 31st, 1968, Halloween. I mention this because later, when I tried to make sense of what I saw that night, some part of my mind kept reaching for that explanation. The holiday, the theatrical tradition of the grotesque, the inherited cultural permission to see monstrous things and call them harmless. It didn't help, but I kept reaching. Jeremy was 23 years old. He had been a scout for BLU, Builders League United, the corporation that employed me, that employed most of the men in Mortem, that in many respects built the town around its own operations and then settled people inside it like furniture. Jeremy had been let go 4 months earlier, not fired for cause, simply released. The HR documentation used the phrase operational redundancy, and I remember reading it and thinking it was the most bloodless pair of words in the English language. He had been a good scout, fast, fearless in that particular way young men are fearless, which is to say he had not yet fully understood that he could die. After the incident with the respawn machine, he understood it completely. Jeremy sat in the chair across my desk and told me about his nightmares. Teeth falling out, a classic, I told him, a very common anxiety dream, nothing to be alarmed about. Then he told me about the figure he kept seeing at the edge of his vision, the sense of being followed, the phone calls that played back his own voice without anyone speaking. I wrote down what he said, and I watched his hands, and I noted the tremor and the dark crescents under his eyes, and I told him he was suffering from stress-induced anxiety with possible dissociative features secondary to trauma. I gave him a bottle of Valium. I told him to call me if his symptoms worsened. He left at 8:17. I watched him go down the hall toward the elevator, and I sat back in my chair, and the television in the corner of my office was showing the evening news, and the anchor was talking about the disappearance of Jules Archibald. I turned it off. I knew Archibald by reputation, knew he was the governor of New Mexico and the architect of the respawn program, and that certain things in the company's research division bore his name in ways I was not officially cleared to know about. I turned the television off because his face made me tired in a way I did not want to examine. I fell asleep in my chair. This is the last genuinely peaceful moment I can account for. I dreamed of a man in a plague mask standing at the end of a long corridor. He was perfectly still. In the dream, I understood that he had been standing there for a very long time, not waiting for me specifically, just standing there because that corridor was where he stood, the way water stands in a low place. I woke up with blood on my hands. Not a metaphor, literal blood both palms already drying at the edges, still tacky at the center. I had not cut myself. There was no wound. I sat in my chair for approximately 90 seconds staring at my hands before I stood up and went to the sink in the corner and washed them, which is either the most rational or the most irrational thing I have ever done in my life. I am still not sure which. On my desk where Jeremy's file had been, there was a photograph. Jeremy on a street corner shot from across the road with a long lens, his back to the camera, not posed, surveilled. On my office wall, written in something that was not paint and was not ink, was an address, Canaghar Road, outside the city limits. Everyone in Mortem knew the slaughterhouse on Canaghar Road. We called it a meatpacking facility. I had signed 17 incident reports with the Canaghar operation listed as place of injury. I had not asked questions. I was good at not asking questions in 1968. Most of us were. I drove out there alone. I want to be honest about that. I could have called the police. I could have called anyone. I drove out there alone because the address was on my wall in something that might have been Jeremy's blood, and because the photograph was on my desk, and because somewhere under my clinical composure, I already knew that official channels were not going to help me. Official channels were part of whatever this was. I could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, not seen, not heard, simply registered in the body. The slaughterhouse was dark when I arrived. Not empty, dark. There is a difference. Empty buildings have a particular quality of silence and absence of pressure. This building had the opposite. The darkness had weight. The parking lot held 3 vehicles I didn't recognize and one that I did. Jeremy's car, the left front door still hanging open, dome lights still on, faint orange glow in the dark like a single coal in a dead fire. I went inside. I will try to describe what I found in the way I would describe it in a medical report, because that framing is the only one I trust myself to use without losing the thread entirely. The facility was operational, not as a slaughterhouse, as something else. The industrial equipment, the rails, the cold storage rooms, the drainage channels cut into the concrete floors had been repurposed. The drainage channels were recently used. The cold storage rooms contained things in varying states of preservation that I will describe only as human remains, numerous, poorly catalogued. The quantity suggested years of accumulation. The available floor space suggested a systematic operation. My professional estimate, formed in approximately 4 minutes of involuntary observation, before I stopped looking directly at what I was seeing, was that the number ran into the hundreds. There was a room at the back of the facility, behind a door stenciled medical. I opened it because I am a doctor, and because the word on the door demanded it of me in a way I couldn't refuse. Medical, my domain, my responsibility. Whatever was happening in there was something I was supposed to understand. The room contained a machine. I had read about the respawn technology in internal memoranda. I had read the clinical framing, cellular reconstruction, neural state preservation, death interval bridging, and I had filed it away as the sort of project that people with more clearance than me were responsible for, the kind of thing I was paid not to think about. Seeing the machine in person was different. It was large, room-filling. It smelled of ozone and something else I could not identify, something organic and wrong, like meat left in standing water. The instrumentation was not the clean engineering of the memoranda. It had been modified, added to. The modifications looked desperate, like a man who has found a thing that mostly works and has spent years trying to make it work better without fully understanding why it mostly works. There were photographs on the wall, test subjects before and after. The before photographs were ordinary, the after photographs were not. The machine did not simply restore the dead. I understood that within approximately 60 seconds of looking at the photographs. What the machine did, what the machine had been doing for years in this room, in this facility, behind this door, was more specific and more terrible than restoration. It returned the body. It did not always return what had been living inside the body. What came back in the body's place was something that wore the original's face and spoke with the original's voice and retained fragments of the original's memory and experienced none of the original's capacity for the things that make a human being bearable to be around. Fear, mercy, the basic animal reluctance to cause pain that most of us carry without knowing it. What came back was the machinery without the operator. I know this because I heard something behind me. He had been a heavy victor, I think, though I never confirmed the name. I had treated him twice for shrapnel wounds 18 months prior. Large man, strong, careful with himself in the way big men sometimes are, as if they are aware of the damage they could do accidentally and choose constantly not to do it. He had hands like shovels and had brought me a small cactus from his windowsill after his second surgery as a thank you gift. I still have the cactus, had the cactus, past tense. What was wearing Victor's body was not Victor. I knew this before I looked at his eyes. I knew it from the sound of his breathing, which was wrong in a way I cannot fully articulate, too regular, like a pump, like something that was performing respiration, because respiration was required for locomotion rather than because it needed oxygen. When I looked at his eyes, I stopped knowing things for a moment. There was nothing behind them that I recognized as cognition. There was something there, something processing, something responding to stimuli, but it was like looking at the light inside a camera. The mechanism was running. The person was not home. He came toward me at a pace that suggested he was not hurrying because he did not need to hurry. I ran. I ran into the basement. This is where I found Jane. His name, I learned later, was John Jane. He had been a soldier, a decorated one, by his own frequent account, though the decorations themselves were somewhat vague on specifics. He was wearing a helmet I had never seen him take off. He was approximately 40 years old and had the build of a man who had spent 20 of those years carrying weight over difficult terrain and had never quite stopped. He was crouched behind an industrial boiler with a revolver in one hand and a flashlight in the other. And when I came around the corner at a run, he pointed the revolver at my face with the focused calm of a man who had done this many times before. I said his name. He looked at me for a long moment. He lowered the revolver. "Doc," he said, "you shouldn't be here." "No," I agreed, "neither should you." We spent approximately 4 minutes in a low, whispered conversation that contained more critical information per second than any exchange I have had before or since. Jane had come to the facility following a spy, a BLU operative named Morno, who had been working a missing persons case on behalf of someone he had not identified to Jane. They had found the briefcase. They had found the slaughterhouse. The spy was somewhere in the upper levels. The building had more levels than the exterior suggested. "The thing upstairs," I said, "the one in Victor's body." "Not Victor," Jane said. "No," I said, "not Victor. There are more of them." I looked at him. "The pit," he said, "there's a pit. They've been running this machine for years, hundreds of subjects. Some of them are still active." He said the word the way you'd say a word in a foreign language you didn't fully trust. "They don't all stay down in the pit. Some of them are still functional enough to move around, follow instructions. Somebody has been keeping them organized." "Who?" He looked at me. The look said, "That's the question, isn't it?" We moved together after that because there was no alternative. The building had us and it was very large. I had my medical bag because I had been a doctor long enough that I carried it reflexively, the way some men carry a hat. Jane had the revolver and a combat knife, and the kind of absolute confidence in his own physical capability that either comes from genuine skill or from the absence of imagination. And in the situation we were in, either would do. Before we moved, Jane told me something I have thought about ever since. He told me that during the debriefing, the one Morno had apparently run after the first encounter in the facility's upper levels. He had been shown a photograph, not of a person, of a record, a personnel file. His own, except that the service history in it extended back further than his own memory did, and included postings to bases that he had no recollection of being assigned to, and bore signatures of commanding officers who he was certain he had never met. The document looked authentic. It looked more authentic than authenticity usually manages. He had laughed at it, he told me. His first instinct had been to laugh. I asked him what had made him stop laughing. He said the photograph in the file wasn't mine. He described it to me. The photograph in the file was of a man who looked exactly like Jane, same build, same face, same forward-leaning posture that comes from years of leading with your weight, but who was clearly not Jane, in the way that a reflection is clearly not a person even when it is perfectly accurate. Something in the photograph was missing. He couldn't name it precisely. He described it, finally, as, the photograph didn't look like a man who had opinions. I filed this away, and I have returned to it many times. We moved through the facility in a method that Jane had clearly practiced somewhere, though I never asked where. He moved in a way that used walls and shadows and the geometry of rooms, and I stayed close and moved when he moved and stopped when he stopped and tried to be quiet, which is something I had never been trained to do, but that turns out to be learnable very quickly under the right conditions. The facility had more levels than the exterior had suggested. This is a feature of buildings that have been expanded in ways their original architects did not intend. They acquire a kind of internal logic that is incompatible with their external presentation, rooms appearing where rooms should not be, corridors bending in directions that contradict the map you have built in your head. I lost track of our elevation several times. I do not know, even now, how many levels the Conagra facility contained. I know we went down at least 3 before we came back up. The lower levels were cold. Not the ambient cold of the desert night, which is the cold of thin air releasing the day's heat into a clear sky. This was mechanical cold, the cold of industrial refrigeration, sustained and precise. Pipes ran along the ceilings. The condensation on them had frozen in places into formations that caught the light from Jane's flashlight and threw it back in small fractured pieces. I kept my hands in my pockets when they were not needed for other purposes. This turned out to be prudent for reasons I had not anticipated. What came at us in the next 3 hours, I will describe not in sequence but in the way it lives in my memory now. As a series of images, each one overexposed, each one occupying more space than the event itself should reasonably require. A resurrected medic. I knew him. His name was Gerhardt. He had been a good physician, by the standards available to us, conscientious, thorough, appropriately skeptical of the company's stranger directives. What came at us in his body in that stairwell was nothing like Gerhardt. It moved wrong, the head at a slight persistent angle, the gait irregular in a way that spoke of a nervous system that had been put back together from a diagram rather than a blueprint. It made a sound that I cannot describe as speech exactly, because speech requires intention, but that used the structures of speech, tongue, palate, larynx, to produce something that resembled words the way a shadow resembles a person. Jane put it down. He did not hesitate. I watched him not hesitate, and I understood something about him that I had not previously known, which was that John Jane had seen things before that required you to act without the luxury of hesitation, and that those experiences had burned out in him whatever circuit normally introduces delay between recognition and response. He was not cruel. He was not detached. He was simply operational in a way that most human beings, mercifully, never have to become. We found the scout. Jeremy was alive. This was not obvious at first. He was in a cage in the deep interior of the facility, in a room that had been a refrigerated storage unit and still held the cold, and he was conscious, but had clearly been conscious for too long without rest. He looked at me when I opened the cage door, and I watched him trying to determine whether I was real. I sat down next to him on the cold floor, and I held his wrist and felt his pulse, and I said, "I'm here. I'm real. You can feel my hand." He said, "They put me in the machine, Dr. Ludwig." I kept my face still. When? Months ago, before they let me go. I think that's why they let me go, to see what happened. Whether anything, he stopped, swallowed. I keep seeing things that aren't there, and things that are there that I can't. He stopped again. I thought of the photographs on the wall, the after photographs. I thought about what I was going to have to decide right now, in this cold room, with a 23-year-old man looking at me with the expression of someone who needs to be told the truth. I gave him the truth in pieces. I told him that the machine had affected his neurological functioning, and that what he was experiencing was a real symptom of a real injury, and not a sign that he was losing his mind. I did not tell him that I didn't know whether the effect would worsen or stabilize. I did not tell him about the photographs. I told him that I was going to get him out of this building. He said, "Is my mother all right?" I said, "Yes." I didn't know. God forgive me, I didn't know. The plague doctor was waiting at the top of the stairwell. I had been seeing him at the periphery for an hour, a shape at the end of corridors, a stillness in doorways, the sense of something watching with an attention that was patient in a way living things are not usually patient. Patience usually implies desire. You are patient because you want something and you are willing to wait for it. The plague doctor's patience did not feel like desire. It felt like time, like a geological process, like something that did not experience urgency, because urgency is a feature of mortality, and the plague doctor had very particular thoughts about mortality. He wore a mask in the old European style, the long beak, the round glass eyes, the dark coat. Physicians in plague years wore them. The theory was that the beak, filled with herbs and spices, would filter the bad air that carried disease. The theory was wrong, of course. The mask didn't filter anything, but it did enforce a certain distance between the physician and the dying, between the professional and the patient. I had thought about that mask design sometimes in the quieter years before Mortem. Had thought about what it meant to put a beak between yourself and what you were treating. He stood at the top of the stairwell and did not move, and I stood at the bottom with Jane beside me and Jeremy behind me, and the sounds of the facility settling into its own dark operations all around us. Jane raised the revolver. The plague doctor tilted his head once slowly to the left, the way you tilt your head at something interesting, the way a doctor tilts his head at a difficult case. Then he stepped aside, out of the doorway, into the dark, gone. Jane looked at me, I looked at Jane, we went up the stairs. I will tell you what I believe now, years later, with whatever perspective distance provides. I believe the plague doctor was something the machine had made that was different from the others. I believe he retained cognition, or something adjacent to cognition, in a way the resurrected soldiers did not. I believe he had an agenda that we didn't understand in 1968, and that I still don't fully understand now. I believe he stepped aside because he wanted us to see what was in the room above. The room above contained Archibald. Jules Archibald, governor of New Mexico, founder of the Jules Archibald Foundation, architect of the Respawn program and the Emesis diazepam distribution network, and 17 other projects whose names I learned from the files in that room, was sitting in an electric chair in the center of the room and was dead. He had been dead for some time. The briefcase that the spy had been following was on the floor beside the chair, open, empty. The files in the room contained 23 years of research, not the sanitized internal memoranda I had been reading. The real documents, test subject records, outcome assessments, the statistical architecture of a program that had consumed hundreds of human beings in the pursuit of a technology that two elderly brothers wanted for reasons that the files described with a frankness that I found, in retrospect, almost admirable. Redmond and Bluedark Mann, twin brothers, the founders technically of both BLU and Red, a detail that had been common knowledge in Mortem in the way that common knowledge exists in company towns, which is to say everyone knew it and no one discussed it, because discussing it felt like an invitation to something. The brothers had been fighting a proxy war for years, running the two corporations against each other, funding the mercenary contracts that employed men like Jane and the Heavy and the Scout. Why two brothers had arranged their mutual commercial interests into the structure of a war was a question whose answer turned out to be because they were dying, and because dying men with unlimited resources sometimes build very large and very terrible things to avoid it. They had funded the respawn program not for military application. For themselves. 2 old men in their Connecticut mansions, each one watching the other's life signs, each one unwilling to die before the other, each one having concluded somewhere in the 4th decade of their lives that the appropriate response to mortality was to simply refuse it, and that with sufficient money and sufficient willingness to do what was necessary to other people, refusal was achievable. The program had not worked cleanly. The files made this clear. What the machine restored was not reliably the person who had gone in. The restoration degraded across iterations. The first death and return was the most complete. Subsequent cycles introduced increasing divergence. By the 3rd or 4th cycle, what the machine returned bore a diminishing resemblance to what had entered. By the 7th or 8th, the resemblance was cosmetic only. After that, there was still something. But you would not call it a person. I sat in that room with those files, and I read, and Jane stood at the door, and watched the corridor, and Jeremy sat on the floor, and did not speak, and the building around us made sounds that I had been trying not to think too carefully about. And I felt something shift in my understanding of the preceding 11 years of my life. The test subject records were the worst of the files. Not because they were detailed. They were, in fact, clinically sparse, written in the detached shorthand of researchers who had made a decision, early on, to maintain a particular kind of distance from their material. The sparseness was the worst part. A man's name, his age, his baseline assessment, the date of his first cycle through the machine, the date of his second, the notations as the iterations accumulated and the deviation scores climbed, and the language in the assessments shifted from clinical concern to clinical interest, and then to clinical indifference. The date on which a man stopped being described as a patient and started being described as a subject. I had been a doctor for 17 years, and I had worked within institutional structures for most of those years, and I understood how institutional language works, how it is designed to make the difficult legible and the unconscionable routine. I had used that language myself. I had written testing incident and operational injury and subject presented with atypical recovery profile, and I had not asked the next question, because the next question led somewhere I had been comfortable not going. Reading those files, I paid the deferred cost of that comfort. I want to be precise about this. I am not performing guilt. I am describing a transaction. I had borrowed something, the ease of not knowing, the warmth of a paycheck attached to a purpose I had chosen not to examine, and the debt came due in that room, with those files, on the floor of a facility that had been running for 23 years on the premise that certain kinds of people could be spent in service of what 2 old brothers wanted. I had worked for this, not knowingly, not directly, but I had treated the mercenaries. I had signed the incident reports. I had been handed the carefully laundered version of what was happening in this building, and I had accepted it because not accepting it would have required me to do something uncomfortable. And being uncomfortable is the thing that the human capacity for rationalization exists specifically to prevent. I put the files down. "We need to take these," I said. "Take them where?" Jane said. It was a good question. I didn't have an answer yet. We got out of the building. This is a sentence that contains approximately 45 minutes of events that I am going to compress. Not because they were unimportant, but because the full account would require me to describe things that still visit me at a frequency I find manageable only by not examining them too closely. What I will tell you, Victor's body came at us again in the main corridor, and Jane did what was necessary, and I did not look away this time. I watched it. I made myself watch it. This was not stoicism. It was medicine. The physician who looks away from the painful thing is not protecting himself. He is simply ensuring that when the painful thing happens to someone he is responsible for, he will have less information than he needs. What came after Victor I will not name. It wore a face I recognized. I will say only that it was not the person whose face it wore, and that the proof of this was not in the eyes or the gait or the irregular speech, but in the specific moment when it had the opportunity to stop and did not take it, because the capacity for mercy is a human capability, and what the machine made did not retain human capabilities. Jane handled it. I am grateful to Jane for this. I have never told him so. The window to say it has long since closed. We came out into the parking lot at approximately 11 in the evening. Cold night. October desert cold, the kind that comes down fast after dark, thin air with no moisture to hold the day's warmth. Jeremy was walking under his own power. Jane still had the revolver. I had the files in my bag. Morno was waiting by the cars. The spy. He was burned right arm, the side of his neck, the kind of burns that result from close-range flash fire and are intensely painful but not immediately life-threatening. He had his jacket folded against the worst of it. He was smoking with his uninjured hand, and he looked at me and at Jane, and at Jeremy with the expression of a man who has revised his assessment of the situation several times in the last hour, and has arrived at a position he is not pleased with. I looked at him for a moment before I spoke. I had been aware of Morno for 2 years. He occupied a particular category in my understanding of BLU's operations, the category of men who knew more than I did and who wore that knowledge with the practiced lightness of a man who carries a weapon he is not legally obligated to declare. He had always treated me with a certain courtesy. The professional courtesy one specialist extends to another, regardless of whether their fields overlap. I had appreciated it, in a removed way, the way you appreciate the functioning of systems you don't control. Standing in that parking lot with the building still behind us and the files in my bag and Jeremy's Valium bottle in my pocket, I understood that Morno's courtesy had been the courtesy of a man who had not yet required anything from me. Now he might. I watched his face to see whether that had changed. It hadn't. Not yet. Something else had, though. He looked tired in a way he had not looked before, which was not the physical tiredness of burns and exertion, but the deeper tiredness of someone who has been carrying a very specific kind of knowledge for a long time, and has finally reached the point where the carrying is harder than the alternative. He said something in French that I did not catch, and then switched to English and said, "The building needs to come down." "There are bodies in there," I said. "People." "There are no people in there," he said. I did not argue with this. I knew it was true, and I knew it was a terrible thing for it to be true, and I knew that the people who had been in there, who had been put in there, who had been processed through that machine in service of 2 old men's refusal to accept the condition that every human being who has ever lived has eventually accepted, deserved better than to be described as not people. But I also knew that Morno was right in the operational sense, and that the operational sense was the sense that currently mattered. Jane found what was needed in the facility's utility room. Industrial solvent and the kind of industrial electrical setup that 1968 health and safety regulations had not yet compelled anyone to make safe. He came back out in 4 minutes. We drove. Behind us, the Conagra slaughterhouse lit up against the desert sky in a way that I watched in the rearview mirror until the road curved and took it from me. I have thought about that fire many times, about the rightness of it and the wrongness of it simultaneously. There are things that need to be destroyed, and the destruction is still a grief. The two are not in opposition. They are in fact the same thing when you do it properly. Archibald's funeral was 3 days later. I should not have gone. This is obvious in retrospect and was obvious to me at the time. But I had the files and I had spent 3 days reading them, and I had arrived at a conclusion about what needed to happen next, and the conclusion required me to be in a room with the men the files were about. The Manns were there, both of them, Redmond in red, Bluedark in blue, each attended by their own contingent of hired men, each watching the other with the specific quality of attention that very old enemies reserve for each other, not hatred exactly, because hatred is energetic, and these two men no longer had the energy for hatred, but something slower and more persistent. Vigilance. The refusal to look away. Morno delivered a eulogy. It was elegant and entirely false. He described Archibald as a dedicated public servant and a visionary entrepreneur and a man of uncommon principle, and I watched him deliver these sentences with the professional fluency of someone who has said many things he did not believe in service of purposes that required the saying. He named me as the killer. He said I had murdered Archibald and subsequently taken my own life, and that the matter was resolved, and that the Jules Archibald Foundation would continue its work in honor of the governor's legacy. I was in the building, in the back against the wall. Jane found me during the reception. He had been debriefed, he said. He had been told things. He had been told to attend the funeral and keep his mouth shut and accept the version of events that Morno was presenting. He had also been shown, in the debriefing, some of what he had suspected about himself, about the clones in the cryogenic storage, about the name Jane being attached to more than one history, about the specific way the company had been managing its veteran mercenary assets. I watched him tell me this. I watched the particular way he held himself while he did it, upright, still, the way a man holds himself when the information he is delivering is information he has not yet found the right internal arrangement for, not collapsed by it, not broken, but changed by it in a way that was still finding its final shape. He had been a soldier for most of his adult life. He had been a specific kind of soldier, the kind that functions best when the objectives are clear, and the chain of command is legitimate, and the cause, however narrowly defined, bears some relationship to things that are worth fighting for. He had operated within the structure of BLU's mercenary contracts because that structure had provided all of those things in sufficiently convincing form. Clear objectives, recognizable hierarchy. A cause that, if you held it at a certain angle, resembled something. Now the angle had shifted. I have known men who, when the structure they depended on collapsed with it. I have known other men who, when the structure fell, revealed that they had been carrying themselves the whole time. Jane was the second kind. The revelation about the clones and the records and the photograph that didn't look like a man who had opinions, all of this had done something to him, but what it had done was clarify rather than diminish. He knew what the company was now. He knew what he had been used for. He knew that the uniform and the orders and the mission structure had been a container for his capabilities, that had never been in service of what he had assumed it was in service of. And having stripped all of that away, what remained was John Jane, who was going to do what needed to be done. He looked at me when he finished talking, and there was something in his face that I had not seen there before, which was uncertainty. John Jane operated at a level of certainty that most men only achieve in retrospect. Watching it give way briefly to something more human, more like what the rest of us walk around with every day, was like watching a fortification develop a crack. Still standing, but different now. I gave him the briefcase. He looked at it. The files aren't in there, I said. I know. The files are somewhere that isn't here. Good, he said, and then, because he was Jane, and because certain things were simply not negotiable with him, regardless of what he had just learned about himself. Someone needs to tell the Mann brothers what's in those files. No one needs to tell them anything, I said. They paid for those files. He considered this. Then someone needs to make sure those files get somewhere the Manns can't keep them quiet. That's what I'm trying to do, I said. He nodded. He straightened his jacket. He walked toward the front of the room. What happened next I watched from the back, and I am going to describe it plainly because it was plain. Jane walked to the front of the room and he picked up the briefcase, the empty briefcase, the decoy, and he stood beside Morno and he looked at the assembled attendees. He said, loud enough to be heard across the room, "The company has been running a human experimentation program out of the Kanagher facility for 23 years. I have evidence. The governor was its architect. These two men," he gestured at Redmond and Bluedark, We're its primary beneficiaries. I want you all to know that." Then the room became very loud. I went out the back. I had an ambulance. This requires explanation, but the short version is, Mortem had a hospital. The hospital had ambulances. One of those ambulances was unlocked at 11:30 in the morning on November 3rd, 1968, and I had urgent reasons to require fast transportation out of the city. I drove north. I was going to see a man in Albuquerque who had a contact at a newspaper, and the newspaper had a contact at the kind of federal authority that was specifically constituted to be interested in the kind of thing I had in my bag. This was a plan. It was not a guaranteed plan. Nothing about the situation was guaranteed. But it was forward motion, and forward motion in a direction other than the one the company wanted me moving in, and that felt like the most I could reasonably accomplish. The road outside Mortem at night is long and empty in the particular way of roads in the desert southwest. Not lonely exactly, because loneliness implies the absence of something you expected to be present, and there was nothing about that road that should have contained anything other than asphalt and sage and the particular quality of desert dark. I had the headlights on. I had the heater running. I had my bag on the passenger seat and Jeremy's Valium prescription in my coat pocket. The bottle I had given him on Halloween that I had taken back when I found him in the facility, that I had been carrying for 3 days and had not opened. I opened it in the car, on the road, not to take one to look. The label said what it always said, emesis diazepam, 5 milligrams, standard formulation. I had prescribed this drug to dozens of patients. I had signed my name below the dosage instructions on hundreds of similar bottles. The pharmaceutical name was correct. The company was the Archibald Foundation, which I had known for years manufactured pharmaceutical lines among its many other operations, which I had accepted without much thought because accepting things without much thought is what the structure of institutional employment is designed to produce in people. The pills were not white. They were blue, very specifically, carefully, deliberately blue. I put the bottle back in my pocket. I drove. The deer came out of nowhere. This is a cliché, and it is also literally what happened. One moment the road was empty. The next moment there was a deer and I swerved and the ambulance left the road at approximately 55 miles per hour, and there was a sound and a period of motion that did not correspond to any motion I had planned, and then there was a kind of stillness that was also not still, and then there was nothing for a while. When something came back, it was not sequential. I am going to try to describe it sequentially because the alternative is not describable at all. There was a bar. Not a metaphor, a physical bar, with tables and chairs and a long wooden counter and bottles arranged on shelves behind it with the particular neatness of a man who takes pride in his work. The light was the yellow warm kind that exists in bars and certain kitchens and almost nowhere else. It smelled of sawdust and bourbon and something faintly mineral that I associated with the desert but could not locate the specific source of. Behind the bar was a man I did not recognize, compact and bearded, and with the kind of stillness that comes from having worked in the same place for a long time. He was cleaning a glass. He looked at me when I came in without any particular surprise. There were other people in the bar. Jeremy was at a corner table with a beer he wasn't drinking, looking out a window at something I couldn't see from where I was standing. At another table, Jules Archibald, or something wearing Jules Archibald's face with more accuracy than the machine's products had managed, was washing his hands in a bowl of water that had materialized on the table for that purpose, not seeming to notice or care about the contradiction. He didn't look up. I sat at the bar. The man behind the bar set down the glass he had been cleaning and picked up another. He said, "What'll you have?" I said, "I don't know what I'm doing here." He said, "Most people don't." I looked at Jeremy. He looked up briefly, and I thought he saw me, but he looked back out the window and did not change expression. Whatever he was looking at through that window was more important. I sat at the bar for what felt like a long time. I was not afraid. This was strange to me, the absence of fear, because I had been afraid for the preceding 3 days with such consistency that I had stopped noticing it. The way you stop noticing a sound that has been playing for too long. Its absence was conspicuous. I sat in it. I thought about the machine, about what the machine was trying to solve and what it actually solved and the distance between those two things. The men who built it wanted continuity. They wanted to preserve the self past the point where the self naturally terminates. They had succeeded in preserving the body. The self was the part that hadn't made the crossing intact. I am a doctor. I have thought a great deal in the professional context about what the self is. The question is not as settled as people outside medicine tend to assume. The body is catalogable. The biochemistry is catalogable. The neural architecture, the electrical patterns, the hormonal balances, all of this can be measured and recorded and in some cases reconstructed. What cannot be reconstructed, what the machine had not managed to reconstruct, was the part that chose. The part that, presented with a situation requiring either mercy or its absence, had an opinion about which one it wanted to be. That is not a mystery I can resolve in a bar in whatever this was. But I understood, sitting there, that it was what the machine had failed to restore, and that the failure was not incidental. It was the whole thing. The self is the choosing. The choosing is what the machine couldn't copy. The man behind the bar set down his glass and said, "You've got somewhere to be, Doc." I looked at him. He nodded at the door. Outside the door, the world was on fire. Not the bar, the world. The desert, the dark road, the wreckage of an ambulance against a telephone pole lit by its own scattered fire, the kind of fire that starts in engines when the engineering fails. I looked at it from the doorway of the bar for a moment. I had been a doctor for 17 years. I had sewn men back together on tables. I had worked the respawn intake assessments and understood, now, what those assessments had been in service of. I had walked into a building full of things that should have been dead and walked out again. I had the files. The files were on the passenger seat of the ambulance, which was on fire. I walked out of the bar and into the fire, and I pulled the bag from the ambulance with both hands, and the handle was hot enough to leave marks on my palms, and I got 10 steps away before the fuel tank made the decision for both of us. I was on my back in the dirt with the bag under my arm. The sky above Mortem, New Mexico, was very clear and very full of stars. I lay there for a while. My hands were burned. My ribs had an opinion about the landing. I was alive in the particular raw and specific way that you are alive when you have just confirmed it unexpectedly, when the fact of your own continued existence arrives not as a background condition but as a positive event, something that happened, something that required work. I sat up, I checked the bag, the files were there, singed at the edges, intact. I stood up, I started walking. The nearest phone was at a gas station 6 miles north. I know this because I walked it. The desert at 3 in the morning in November is not a comfortable environment for a man in a dress shirt with burned hands and bruised ribs, and I do not wish to suggest that I walked it with anything other than considerable discomfort, and a growing conviction that several things in my thoracic region required professional attention. But I walked it. I want to be clear about what I mean when I say this, because I think people sometimes hear a story like this and extract the wrong lesson. I am not telling you that I was brave. I do not know whether I was brave. I know that I was afraid. I said the fear had gone away in the bar, and it had, but it came back when I hit the dirt with my ribs against the bag handle, came back as a high, thin sound in the back of the skull, the kind of fear that isn't about a specific threat, but about the general condition of being in a situation that has repeatedly demonstrated its willingness to kill you. I walked in spite of it, not in the absence of it. I think this is what separates what the machine made from what it was trying to make. The machine could not create something that chose to do a hard thing in the presence of fear, because creating that would have required creating the fear, and the machine did not make things that were afraid. It made things that were thorough, things that were persistent, things that moved toward objectives without the friction of reluctance or the weight of grief. What it could not make was something that had every reason to stop and kept going anyway, something that knew the cost and paid it without pretending the cost was small. We are not the sum of our capabilities. We are the sum of our choices in the presence of our limitations. I reached the gas station at 4:47 in the morning. The attendant was a young man who looked at me with the controlled alarm of someone who has been trained to be calm in emergencies, but has not yet had the training fully tested. He handed me the phone without asking questions. I called the number I had memorized 3 days earlier. The man in Albuquerque answered on the third ring. I told him where I was. I told him what I had. I told him that the ambulance on fire on the road 6 miles south was mine, and that I had not been in it when it went up, and that he should probably send someone to make it clear to anyone who found it that the driver had survived, because the company's preferred version of events included my death, and I preferred to be less cooperative with that narrative than they were counting on. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Stay there." I leaned against the gas station wall. The attendant brought me a cup of coffee and a clean rag for my hands and said nothing, which was exactly what I needed. I held the coffee in my burned hands and looked east, where the sky was beginning to do what desert skis do before dawn, not lighten exactly, not yet, but change quality, become something other than night before it committed to being day. The files were in the bag against the wall. Archibald's foundation was under investigation within the month. The documents took time to navigate the bureaucratic geography between where they entered the system and where they needed to end up, but they arrived. The Manns were not arrested. Men of that kind are rarely arrested. But their program was dismantled and their facility was officially condemned, and the weight of institutional knowledge shifted, permanently, in a direction they could not redirect. Morno disappeared. Jane was never formally connected to what happened at the funeral. Jeremy, I heard, years later, through a channel I had cultivated specifically for the purpose of hearing, was doing better. The Valium I had prescribed him was the right medication and not the other kind. This mattered to me more than I can explain efficiently. The plague doctor I never saw again. I don't know what he was. I know what the machine made in general terms from the files and from what I saw that night. I do not know which iteration the plague doctor represented or whether iteration was even the right framework for whatever he had become. I think about him sometimes. The stillness, the tilted head, the way he stepped aside. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe the machine had run him through enough times that what came back on the last cycle was something that had made its peace with what it was and what it wasn't, and had arrived at a position of not contentment exactly, but acceptance. The acceptance that comes not from satisfaction but from exhaustion, from having traveled far enough down a road to understand that what you were looking for was not at the end of it. I stood up from the bar stool in that place between dying and not dying, and I walked out through the door. I still don't know what that means clinically. I have descriptions for it and none of them satisfy me. What I know is that I walked back in the direction of the living because the files were there, and the work was there, and the gas station was 6 miles north, and the phone was at the end of those 6 miles, and the man in Albuquerque was at the end of that phone call. And because Jeremy was still out there, still trying to sort out what was real and what wasn't, and someone needed to know his name. The sun came up over the Mortem basin, and the desert turned the color it turns at that hour, bone and rust, and a very specific shade of gold that belongs to nowhere else on earth. And I sat against the outside wall of a gas station in New Mexico with burned hands and cracked ribs, and a bag full of evidence that the world was worse than most people knew. And I drank the worst coffee I have ever tasted in my life, and I was glad to taste it. That's the whole of it, that's the story. I was not the strongest man in that building. I was not the fastest or the most dangerous or the most capable of absorbing damage. Jane was stronger. Morno was faster. The things the machine had made were more dangerous than all of us combined, in the specific sense that they did not break under the weight of what they were doing because they could not feel the weight. What I had was what the machine couldn't copy. I knew what I was doing was terrible. I knew the cost of it, in real time, with full information. I knew that the people in that pit had been people, and that burning the building was not justice, and that the files would help and would not be enough, and that helping anyway was the only available option. I carried all of that and I kept going. That is what we are. Not the absence of fear, not the absence of grief, not the absence of the full and accurate understanding that what we are doing is costly and uncertain and may not be enough. Just the carrying of it, just the going on. The machine never figured that out. I don't think it ever could.